From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. Joined live with Understanding Ag consultant Brian Dougherty, and we're going to be talking about annual cropping systems with some cattle integration and economics behind it. Brian is a regenerative agriculture consultant for Understanding Ag and a student of soil. His roots are planted in Northeast Iowa, where he co-owned and operated a family dairy farm. He applies his passion for working with nature and his background as a farmer and agricultural engineer to help heal broken nutrient, water, and energy cycles to make regenerative food production a reality and make farming fun again. Now, Brian, I think I said in there that you're in Northeast Iowa, but you're actually in Wisconsin now, aren't you?
Yeah, that's correct. I really appreciate the chance to be here today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. Always enjoy talking with you. Brian was one of the speakers at our Viroqua event this year, and then he's also going to be a speaker again at EcoAg after last year he was a speaker as well. So we appreciate you taking the time and joining us.
Yeah, appreciate the chance to be here today and hopefully talk about some economics and a little bit of livestock integration, whatever else is on your mind.
So why don't you get in a little bit about the background that your background and then what you're doing with Understanding Ag and what fields you are specializing in.
Sure. So as you mentioned in the intro, my background is as a dairy farmer. So I grew up in Northeast Iowa on the family farm and took that over in a partnership with my brother in the early 90s. So I was just a dairy farmer for like 20 years, and I just thought that's all I would ever do. But life throws curveballs at you, and I really kind of got burned out with that. Just saw where the industry was heading, and it was kind of that get big or get out mentality. And I just decided I didn't want to go down that road and milk 600 cows and basically just be an employee manager at that point. So I decided to actually leave the farm, and I thought I was gonna kind of get out of agriculture and do something different. So I went back to school for ecological engineering or agricultural engineering, and it was actually then I started learning about soil, and I started realizing all of these, environmental issues that I was working on as an engineer all come back to how we manage our land. And so I basically, long story short, I ended up right back in agriculture again. I did my master's on soil health and water quality at Iowa State. I worked for ISU Extension for several years as a field engineer, but my passion was always soil. And so about 2.5 years ago, I had the opportunity to come and work for Understanding Ag as a regenerative ag consultant. So I kind of jumped at the chance to do that. So basically what I do is I work primarily with row crop producers and people trying to integrate more small grains into the rotation, things like that, and integrate livestock into their crop ground. So just trying to figure out how to make that whole system work a little bit better, on the efficiency side and on the economic side of things. And so that's kind of my day job. And then on the side, I'm partnered on a operation south of Mount Horeb, Wisconsin called Wild Type Ranch. And we're kind of just getting into it, but we're doing some pastured grass-fed lamb, direct-to-consumer, and pastured pork, and meat birds, and a few egg layers as well. So kind of got that going on the side and doing the consulting full-time with Understanding Ag.
We just sent in our last load of hogs for the summer, so our hands are clean of hogs right now. It's always kind of a nice graduation at the end of summer. Would you consider the farm that you grew up on, that dairy farm, pretty conventional? And if so, what made you start moving into some of this weird stuff?
Yeah, it was very conventional. I mean, basically, we did what we were supposed to do as good farmers. I went to school in the early 90s, just did community college and did, farm management and dairy herd management. And it was all about, more production, basically, just get more milk out of the cows, the push then there were a fair amount of grass-based dairies around even then, but the trend was definitely towards confinement. We had an old tie stall barn. So we modernized the whole operation, made it more efficient, built a new freestall barn, put in a parlor, went for high production, and that worked really well, honestly, in the 90s and the 2000s. But around about 2008, you know, the dairy industry really took a nosedive, and milk prices were super low. It cycles up and down, but it got pretty bad, and that's kind of when I saw the writing on the wall. Unfortunately, for small dairy farms, I just really didn't see milking 150 cows like we were, how that was going to be viable long term, not especially trying to have two incomes supported from that dairy. So it was very conventional, but my brother and I both have always been a little bit out of the box, as far as thinking. We looked very hard at doing direct to consumer even then, building a processing plant, making some cheese and things. Ultimately, we decided not to do that, but we've always been open to doing things a little bit differently, I would say. And so I was kind of primed in a way to, kind of think outside the box and maybe go down this regenerative route. Unfortunately, I just didn't do it when I was farming, and I was never really taught any of this, and that's what really frustrated me. As a consultant, what drives me is I don't want that to happen to other farmers. I wish I could go back 30 years and I knew then what I know now, or somebody had taught me, how soil functions and how everything is connected, and all of, the challenges we were seeing on the farm, how there's actually solutions to those that don't have to cost a ton of money. And so that's kind of what I try to do now as a consultant. But yeah, I started out very conventionally, so I understand that world because I've lived it. But if you want to continue on as what we'd call a smaller producer in this day and age, I don't think just commodity production is really working anymore. I talk to a lot of producers that are just growing corn and soybeans, and their backs kind of up against the wall. And that's why we're focusing on, okay, what can we do on the economic side to make things a little bit easier, and what can they do to survive as a small farm?
Yeah. To go back to your dairy stuff, if you were to start over today, say you got plot back on your home family farm and you had to run a dairy in a regenerative way, what would you change? So like I think of a dairy farm, I'm thinking of confinement type freestyle barn, alfalfa corn rotation. You're feeding your TMR mix daily.
Mhm.
Um, I struggle with even that closest field next to the freestyle barn, at least getting him out into a grazing situation for even a month at a time or something. Um, and then I think that there's also some interesting, forage crops like grain or like sorghum and some other smaller grains that could be mixed in, swapping out some of the corn production. But what would you do differently now after being in the position that you're in?
Yeah, if I had to go back and start all over again, I would do it completely different. It would be a grass-based dairy from day one, and I would keep the machinery costs as low as possible. We probably still would have invested in some different facilities, just to get more centrally located so you could graze it more efficiently. But other than that, I would have spent as little money as possible on machinery. Have a skid steer, a tractor or two, a manure spreader. That's it. Because the machinery just kills you. I mean, even if you're running older stuff like we were and just kind of wrenching on it yourself, trying to keep things going, it still just eats you up. It's getting more and more expensive, every day to keep that machinery going. So I would minimize that to the extent possible, and I would try to graze as long as possible throughout the year. It's definitely more difficult with dairy cows because you still are trying to get that production. You need super high, forage quality, high bricks forages if you're going to get milk. But I think it's entirely doable. There's lots of people out there doing it. So I would go that route. Daily moves, long rest periods, all the things we talk about with adaptive grazing. That's essentially what I would do. And I'd probably go seasonal as well with the dairy, just to give yourself a little bit of time off. So that would be the approach I would take.
You go seasonal milking? Would you go 2 times a day, or would you try to get into a one time a day rotate milking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably stick with 2 times a day, and then maybe when you get later in the lactation, you could switch to once a day. I know a few people have tried the once a day, and they've ended up going back to twice a day. But yeah, it can be a real grind milking twice a day, even in a grass-based dairy. But if you get set up with a fairly efficient milking parlor, I mean, it's a heck of a lot easier, honestly, than confinement where you're just nonstop all summer, basically harvesting crops. You're doing 4 cuttings of hay. You're doing, we were doing rye for silage. We were growing oats. We were chopping corn silage. We were putting up corn for grain. Just all you do all summer is just crop work, and it seems like there's never a break. Whereas if you're a grass-based dairy, you're not dealing with any of that or very little of it because you're not having to harvest all that feed and bring it to the cow. Just looking at the economics of that,
Right.
I was looking at some numbers. This is probably 6 months ago, but it was like $1,250 per cow per year just in overheads to harvest that feed and haul it to the cow. So, that's not the feed cost. That's just all the machinery and everything else that goes into that. And then on the flip side of it, you got what comes out of the back end of the cow. Anytime we add distance between that cow's butt and the ground, we're costing ourselves money. That's another, on a conventional dairy, probably $250 per cow per year, if we're honest about the full cost of that. All the equipment, the fuel, the tankers, the storage, scraping your barns out every day. You can get rid of a vast majority of that cost on a grass-based dairy.
Yeah, and I kind of like. I mean, I'm not. I guess I'm not familiar with what milk prices are right now, but you think about beef prices. You throw a beef bull in with your dairy herd, and you start spitting out these crosses that are actually selling for ridiculous amounts at the sales barn. Um, you tie in some more grazing systems with those animals, and then your heifers or your dry cows away from the barn. I think you could have some success with it.
Yeah, there's definitely opportunity there on the dairy beef side, and a lot of conventional dairies are taking advantage of that too. Once sex semen came along, it's a cool technology, but honestly, that was, in a way, that was kind of the death knell of the dairy industry because they made it so easy to have as many heifers as you wanted whenever you wanted. You just breed everything to, female sex semen. But then the market kind of flooded with heifers and the prices crashed. These things correct themselves over time. But now they're in a situation they can breed the top, 40% of their herd, whatever. The females, save those back. Those are your replacements. Everything else can get bred to a beef bull. And so we've got, it's a, pretty decent dairy beef. A lot of people argue Holsteins are not great, obviously, as a grazing animal, but some of those crosses, they can make a pretty good grazing animal and pretty high quality product at the end of the day. So there's a big
Yeah, but I mean
opportunity
they're
there.
they st- they're already in most of those cases they're probably already feeding them the corn silage anyways. So if you're worried
Yep.
about performance, you bring a creep feeder out there or something, and
Yep.
even just if you're still on the corn silage thing, you can still do that on pasture.
Hmm.
Would
Yeah.
you switch anything in your silage mixes? Like, have you had mentioned you guys were doing some rye. What do you think of sorghum?
Yeah. I mean, when we were, I would say almost all dairies, in the 90s, early 2000s, were just doing standard corn silage, alfalfa. Those were your main two forages. Maybe you'd put up some dry hay if the weather cooperated, but most people just went to silage because it was easier. But now we're seeing more and more dairies that are kind of looking at the economics of that, even just on the conventional side and the cost of putting that alfalfa up 4 times a year. And sometimes that doesn't pencil. So they're going to more annual forages. And then you can get some diversity in the rotation. So you can get some significant biomass, with things like sorghum, sudan grass, some millets. You can get a lot of warm season species in there. You can mix it with cool seasons and get basically season long forage production. You can either graze that or put it up for silage. So that's a really good option economically, is to go to more annual forages. You can really push a lot more diversity that way, which I like. So, I haven't looked at the economics of that specifically, but I know the farmers that have tried that really seem to like that system. So they're kind of alternating, between corn silage and annual forages rather than having that alfalfa in the rotation.
Yeah. So getting back to the commodities, I get frustrated in our world because I feel like it's a doom and gloom situation right now in the commodity sector. Um, what is your outlook on it? Obviously, someone who's growing corn and soybeans, I always talk about like the spring. People were posting on Twitter or Facebook you know, their estimated return on the crop, and they're looking at just losses, and they're still sticking it in the ground. Um, I guess what is the updated? Have we moved anywhere with the commodity prices? Are we still looking at a pretty difficult fall here? And what are you guys working with when you get a commodity person? Where are you trying to nudge them towards?
Yeah, I don't follow the markets day to day. I'm not really, I'm not a grain producer, so I don't keep a super close eye on it. But yeah, it's looking pretty ugly right now, both corn and soybeans. So I've just looked at some ISU, Iowa State University crop budgets for 2025, and I just took their numbers right out of what they're projecting for the year, and I plugged it into, their budget calculator, and assuming, I think I had like $280 for land rent in there. So it depends on where you're at, what that rent's going to be. But it was basically like $150 an acre loss on corn, figuring $4 corn. They're probably lucky to get $4 at the elevator. So it's pretty ugly. Soybeans probably aren't much better. And I know cotton and rice, I don't know if there's any commodity anybody's going to make money on this year. So the outlook is not good, and I don't know what next year is going to bring. But like you said, it's kind of funny. One of our other consultants, we were at a meeting one time, and he asked how many people are growing corn and soybeans, and everybody's hand goes up. How many people are losing money on it this year? Everybody's hand goes up. How many people are going to grow it again next year? Everybody's hand goes up. It's like we're just guys are just kind of stuck in this. I call it the commodity trap. We're kind of stuck in this system. There's not really any great markets for much other than corn and soybeans in a lot of places in the Midwest. So we just kind of keep going along with the system, but it's really set up to, I know this kind of sounds doom and gloom, but it's basically kind of designed to drive farmers out of business. I mean, that's how the system works. Either you get better, you get more efficient, more yield, and you keep chasing that rabbit, or you're going to get driven out of business. That's what we've been seeing for decades. Our farm numbers have crashed over the last 50 to 70 years. There's a lot of factors there, but it is what it is. So I just kind of lay it out to people when I'm talking about this stuff. Look, if you keep going down this road, and I took farm numbers and projected them into the future, if we just keep going on the trend that we're going right now, 50 years from now, 75% of their farms will not exist. That's the world we're looking at. Commodities, it's kind of a losing game if you want to just have kind of a small farm and typical family style and have a decent life and make some income. That's a tough road to hoe now. So what I focus on, or just in general our company, we're looking at what can we do to opt out of that system in some way, or at least make it a little more profitable. And that's where the livestock piece comes in. A lot of people say, well, I don't have any fence, I don't want to mess with cattle. I get it. It's not for everybody. But even if they don't have cattle, there's a lot of things you can do with nutrient management. I was just visiting with a producer yesterday, and we were looking at their soil test recommendations from the co-op, and even just using university recommendations, they had high, I'm just going to use phosphorus as an example. They had high phosphorus levels in their field. And if you look at the university data, it says your probability of getting a yield response from adding phosphorus, it's basically nothing. It's like 5%. And that doesn't even account for the money you have to pay to buy that fertilizer. And the recommendation from the co-op was to put on $110 worth of phosphorus, or 110 pounds of phosphorus. So it's just, I don't think the co-ops understand, the financial stress that producers are under, and they're just doing the same old recommendations to put fertility out there that's probably not even going to make that farmer any money. It's just a net loss. And
Well,
so I,
they're I think they're in a tough spot too. I think that's part of the
yep,
problem.
yeah, I mean they're in the business of moving products, so they can't just pull everything back either. This is going to affect everybody. It's not just the farmers. It's going to trickle down. But the problem is the farmer, the old saying, they're price takers and not price makers. They're at the end of the line, so they get whatever scraps are left over after everybody else takes their piece of the pie. So I focus a lot on fertility because I think that's the low hanging fruit where producers can really save some money. Now, we can't necessarily go cold turkey. Again, context is our first soil health principle. We have to look at their context, where their soil's at. Can they get away with pulling things back? But a lot of people are just over applying fertility. So that's one. Herbicides, we can take a look at that and see if they've got even just like poor water quality and things like that, they can save some money there. I look at nitrogen in particular. A lot of people, again, are just putting on more nitrogen than they really need to, and then focus on fixing the soil. So the soil will naturally cycle more of these nutrients so they don't have to write as many checks. Now, that's a little bit longer term strategy there, but that's where I start with row crop producers. And then if they have livestock, and a lot of them do, and a lot of times they're just standing in a lot somewhere. So that is a huge opportunity in this 2025 crop year. It actually makes more sense to take corn or soybeans, pick whichever, it doesn't matter. Just take it out of production and seed down a field for the entire year into a full season grazing mix. Get those cattle out of the yard or get them off the pastures that are overgrazed and put them on your crop ground. So, and again, it's every
Yeah.
situation's different. The economics of that are going to vary from farm to farm, but just running basic back of the envelope numbers on it, you're going to make way more money doing that than you are obviously losing money growing a commodity. So that's another thing I'll encourage people to do.
Here's a frustrating thing. Last week I was in with a financial advisor, and he brings up non-agriculture guy. He brings up a stock, and he's talking about Corteva, which is the stock that essentially came from DuPont, and they own Pioneer and a lot of agricultural type companies. And, this stock is performing super well. It's up, I think it's up 15% in the last year. I'm like, well, how does that make sense? That company is performing well when all the producers who buy their products are on the verge of collapse. I don't know. They seem to be making a lot of money. It's like, so somebody along this line is making money. You have that company who probably controls a lot of the seed that's going in the ground is all time highs,
Yep.
making profit.
Yeah.
And that's just
Yeah.
that's the frustration of the system. And
Yeah. There
and the
was.
farmer's sitting here essentially like you're sitting here waiting on a bailout every year. Well, at some point, if the right person, I would argue, is trying to drive down the debt in the country, or the wrong person, in your perspective, comes in and says, no, we're not doing the bailout this time. Then what happens? I mean, we're on the verge of, it's just like such a thin line here.
Yeah, there was just an article that was making the rounds online specifically about that, just talking about, it was focused on consolidation and basically industry capture. Everybody's probably heard the numbers. It doesn't matter if it's beef or pork or poultry or fertilizer or seed or whatever. There's very few companies left that control a vast majority of the market, and that just really puts a squeeze on people. And they may be doing just fine economically, but that's not trickling down to the farmer. Like I said, we get the crumbs that are left over at the
No.
end of the day.
Well,
And yeah,
I saw someone posted yesterday that there's talks of subsidies to help the heifer retention.
yep.
So what's going to happen to the beef market then?
Yeah, it would be better out in the long run for everybody if the government would kind of stay out of those sorts of things and just let the market correct itself, rather than, distorting it, which is what they've unfortunately what the farm bill does, back to the commodities. It just causes people to grow things where it doesn't really make any sense to grow them, but that's what the market per se wants because of crop insurance subsidies and things like that. But it's just distorting everything. So I can't fix policy, but that's where I would start. If I could wave my magic wand, is do something with the farm bill and kind of get rid of a lot of those market distortions and just let things work a little.
Yeah, the farm bill should not be connected to the SNAP program and those programs. I don't think. Um, so you're talking with these. I think one of the cool things that you guys do as consultants is you don't sell a jug of something to fix these problems. So when you're discussing the nutrient management things, you want to dive in a little bit deeper. Let's use it for an example. The guy that says, I haven't had cattle in 30 years. I don't have fencing. We have all these annual crop fields. I'm not getting cattle. What's a solution for them, from your perspective?
Yeah, so we start with the soil health principles and just kind of bringing soil function back because that's really the foundation that you have to build on in order to be able to do these other things I was talking about with reducing inputs. So you have to have well aggregated soil if you're going to go into a more what we call a regenerative system where it's going to be much lower input. Because if the soil can't breathe and it can't infiltrate water, basically I just call that a dysfunctional soil, and it's not going to cycle nutrients, and you're going to end up with plant health issues, and you're going to be throwing fungicides and everything else at it, basically as kind of a band-aid, or you're treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying problem. So if a farmer really wants to be more resilient and more profitable in the long run, you got to start with the soil. You got to fix that and get that to function well, because that's your asset base that you have to work with. They just call it, if it's like farming vertically instead of horizontally, instead of trying to run 10,000 acres, let's fix the soil. Maybe you run a little bit smaller operation where you can get things done more timely and kind of approach it that way. Now, everybody's going to do that a little bit differently, but that's where I would start, because that's how we ultimately reduce our fertility inputs, our nitrogen, phos, potassium, things like that. So I would start there. And there's lots of things we can do on the nutrient side, looking at just the different timing of application, the type of products they're applying. A lot of what we put on our fields, it's killing our biology. The biology is what makes the whole thing work to begin with. That's what builds aggregation. It's plants working with the biology in the soil. So we got to start there because that's the foundation. And then we can start looking at all these other little tweaks we can make along the way to at least not inhibit, but ideally enhance your soil biology at the same time as you're applying whatever product you need to grow your crop. So we can look at, you know, the bugs in a jug. Just, I'm not saying they're good or bad. They're a tool. They have their place. And starting out, if your soil biology is not where it should be, that can be one thing you can do to try to boost things a little bit. You can do this yourself. You can make compost extracts. There's lots of things you can do to kind of kickstart that system and get it working. So then you can start backing down on some of these input costs. And the other thing that I'm always going to focus on is keeping a living root in the soil, because you cannot build aggregates without living roots. The only way to do it is with plants. So if a farmer has not been growing any cover crops in the off season, that's where we got to start in a corn bean rotation. And we often hear, well, gosh, I can't afford to plant cover crop. Seed's too expensive. I don't have time, whatever. But if you really look at the economics of the cover crop, just giving it credit for the amount of erosion that it reduces and the amount of nitrate leaching it prevents, that will pay for a majority of cover crop mixes right there. And nobody ever takes credit for that. That's nitrogen you're going to save instead of going into the groundwater or out your tile line. That's $5 to $10 an acre every year if you got to buy that back. Erosion is another, 15 to 25, $30 an acre per year. If we just figure an average erosion rate, if you had to buy those nutrients back that you just lost in soil erosion, that's a huge cost. Now, nobody ever writes a check for that, and that's the problem. If people had to write a check for the stuff that ended up in the river, you would see a lot of change happen very quickly. But it's kind of this slow thing, and people just ignore it because it doesn't really show up year to year. But in the long run, it is costing you that, because then your fertility in your field is going to be lower because the stuff that's eroding is your best soil. So then you're going to end up buying more fertilizer to make up for it. So right there, we got to fix those two things, keep that ground covered. And then that doesn't even count all of the other benefits of having that cover crop. Actually building aggregates, it's going to improve your yield over time. because your soil's going to function better and you're going to have to throw less inputs at it. So, and you can do a biomass test, simple test. Anybody can do this. Clip off a 3 by 3 foot area, send it into the lab, and they'll tell you what's in that cover crop. So one of our consultants just did this a couple years ago, and I was just looking at his test. Now, this was a big cover crop. It was like 6 tons of dry matter, but I did the math on it, and there was $240 worth of nutrients in just in the above ground biomass in that cover crop. I've done the same thing at Wild Type Ranch here. We put in a diverse mix this spring. I sent in a biomass sample, and per ton of dry matter in that cover crop, if I had to buy those nutrients, it's about $60 per ton. Just nitrogen, phos, potassium, sulfur. That's it. So people aren't accounting for the true value of cover crops. And if they did, I think we would see cover crops everywhere.
Hello everybody, this year marks a milestone, the 50th annual Acres U.S.A. EcoAg Conference and Trade Show, happening December 1st through the 4th, 2025 in Madison, Wisconsin. For 5 decades, this event has been the nation's premier gathering for farmers, ranchers, researchers, and industry leaders who believe in building soil health, resilient farm systems, and thriving rural economies. Join us for 4 days of expert-led workshops, dynamic keynote sessions, and the largest EcoAg trade show in the country. All designed to give you the tools and connections you need to grow smarter and farm with a purpose. This year's lineup includes innovators like Gabe Brown, Joel Salatin, Rick Clark, Neil Kinsey, Dr. James White, Dr. Don Huber, Helen Attow, Dan Kittredge, Will Harris, Aaron Silva, Dr. Nasha Winters, and many, many more. Don't miss your chance to be part of this historic 50th anniversary celebration at EcoAg 2025. Register today at the link in the bio.
What's your? I know each area is different. Let's use Midwest. We're probably, yeah, a lot of the corn and soybean production is happening. What would be your go-to kind of starter cover crop mix for someone to put in following corn?
Yeah, after corn, so it's assuming they're going back to soybeans. A simple way to start is just to do cereal rye because that's a really good fit ahead of soybeans. Because soybeans, they're a legume, so we're trying to basically balance out the system. Soybeans tend to, they're not great for your soil if we think about what's happening. So anytime you plant a legume of any sort, just as a monoculture, usually it's going to cause some issues with the soil because the carbon to nitrogen ratio is very low generally in legumes. So we want a high carbon crop to offset that. So we put cereal rye in front of it. We can usually plant green right into that cereal rye and then terminate it afterwards. And that does multiple things for you. Again, it's balancing out that carbon to nitrogen ratio. And rye is really good if you can spray it out and get it to lay down, or if you want to roll it, that works. It's really good for weed control, especially things like water hemp and Palmer amaranth, things like that people are struggling with. So you can get multiple benefits of it. It armors the soil, it keeps your soil temps cooler, it prevents, evaporation loss from the soil. There's years you can get caught if it's too wet, too dry. You got to manage it appropriately. So if it's going to be a dry year, I would terminate it early, 2 weeks ahead of time, just so you don't have that moisture competition. If it's wet, I'd let it grow, plant into it, and then terminate it. So going, after corn into soybeans, that's kind of an easy button. Just put in rye because you can put it in. I mean, you can put it in December and you're still going to have rye the next year. It's going to be a little slower, but it's super resilient. It'll grow just about anywhere. It'll almost always overwinter. So that's where I would start after corn. Now going to soybeans the
So
following
let me
year.
hold on. Let me
Yeah.
let me let me give you this scenario. Take away the option of soybeans. So you want to do corn every other year, but
So
you
you
can't
want to
grow soybeans.
can't grow soybeans. So then I would try to put a small grain in the rotation. Now you got to have a market for that, but so yeah, you could go corn and you could go into a small grain. Then you're going to want to change up or you could, if I was going to do that, honestly, what I would do, I'd plant corn, I'd grow cereal rye or triticale or winter wheat or something like that, and I'd grow it for seed. and I'd go into the next year and
Yeah.
I'd harvest that midsummer the next year, and then I can put in a multi-species cover crop, and that's going to prime the soil for corn again the following year. And ideally, I would graze that. So
Yeah.
if I could,
I mean,
or
that's where
soybeans.
livestock would come in handy.
Yep.
It was I was out at Gabe Brown's last week or 2 weeks ago, and it makes tons of sense what they're doing. He goes in and they create that small grain mix that goes right into hogs.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing, like if you have the dairy operation, instead of going corn, which a lot of those guys are going corn on corn on corn, alfalfa for 3 years or whatever they're doing. But you could go every other year with corn, and then what could you grow there to then supplement either your TMR mix or turn it to silage?
Yeah, there's lots of options on a dairy because you can feed just about any of it through the cows. That's where those annual mixes would come in. So your warm season grasses just put on a ton of biomass. Like I said, I would do some sorghum sudan, have some pearl millet in there. You're going to want to probably use BMR, brown midrib, high digestibility forages. If you're going into a dairy, I would have some warm season legumes in there to balance out that mix. I'd throw in probably like some forage collards or something like that. A pretty diverse mix. I would more and more, especially if you can get it in like midsummer. I want to get as many plant families as possible in that mix. So we've been talking about diversity for a long time, but I could put together like a 15-way mix and we think, man, that's just huge diversity. And all it could be is the grass, legume, brassica. It's still only 3 plant families. So I want to see other stuff in there. I love sunflowers in mixes. They're awesome nutrient accumulators. You can do lots of different things. Some of it's not that digestible for livestock, but things like flax. But even just having a half a pound or a pound of it in there, it's a different plant family. You can do buckwheat. There's lots of other things you can put in that mix that will really help stimulate that soil biology in the long run. Because the more plant families you get out there, I'll just call it magic. We don't fully understand what happens, but there's something synergistic that happens underground where those plants just start to work together better. They help each other out essentially. So yeah,
Yeah,
after
and
corn, yeah,
I've been putting buckwheat in all the mixes this year, and I'm just impressed by number one, it doesn't seem to compete with things. Like it grows on its own. Everything else seems to grow well around it. And I've even planted it on our later fall season type plots here, and it still gets to the point where it's flowering. And to me, it did its job because it does a lot of work in the soil.
yeah,
But I
it's a
think
great option.
people usually classify it as more of a warm season plant in the spring type crop. But I've liked what it's done even planting it late here in August.
Yep. Yeah, and I've known people who have actually double cropped with buckwheat. So small grain and put
Yeah.
in buckwheat, harvest it for seed. So lots of options there.
All right. So the guy, the conventional or the normal commodity rotation of corn and soybeans, how would you handle post soybean going into corn?
Yeah, so on both of those, I should mention if they would go along with it, I'd like to see them put in shorter season hybrids and varieties because that just allows us a longer window to get a cover crop in there. Especially in that soybean year, if you can do an early soybean and plant it early, that seems to work really well. Or like a short season bean and plant it early. Then you got lots of time in the fall, and now we can start pushing diversity in that corn bean mix because it's tough after corn because that's most people are going to harvest mid October. We can get the beans out earlier, and then we can get in. You're probably still going to maybe want a little bit of rye in the mix, or you might go with winter wheat or something that's not going to cause as much competition the following year going back to corn. But then I would try to get in a couple different types of brassicas. Rapeseed's fairly cold tolerant. Kale can be a good option in the fall. You might even throw a little buckwheat in there, depending on how late it gets. And you're gonna want to try to get some legumes in there, obviously, if you're going back to corn. So balansa clover can be a good option. There's several legume species. Hairy vetch is a really good one. Now you got to have your planter set up to be able to plant into that stuff the next year. So there's obviously some management that goes into that. Austrian winter peas, that would be another one. So things like that, I would try to get 30, maybe 40% legumes in that mix, and the rest would be grass and brassicas.
So when it comes to the term, you've talked about a little bit terminating the crop to prepare for the next annual. You know, coming up, I was introduced to Gabe stuff the most, so I assumed that tillage was the enemy. Um, I've definitely seen examples now of people who are really successful with tillage. I would argue there's a lot of biology going on. They've figured it out. Folks like Gary Zimmer and others. And there's that hanging thing over about glyphosate. Like,
Yep.
what's really happening with it? So, do you think that, like, what's your guys' position on that? Are you still, tillage is the devil, or are you guys a little bit more open to going both ways
Yeah,
on it?
we're definitely open. We definitely have been accused of being anti-tillage, and maybe that's partially deserved, but no, to me it's whatever's going to get the job done. I am not anti-tillage. I am anti-excessive disturbance. That's really how we should say it. And that disturbance can be physical or chemical. So there's a lot of soils that are really screwed up just from decades of just excessive chemical use, and there's lots of issues. And I know they're going to talk about that at the Acres conference specifically with glyphosate, but glyphosate's been incredibly well researched. I guess my worry is, okay, we say glyphosate is the devil, and I totally agree. It's a nutrient chelator, it's an antibiotic. It's not a good thing really to be putting under soil necessarily. But do we know that any of the other herbicides are really any better? So some people are like, I don't want to use glyphosates, and they use paraquat. Well, that stuff will straight up kill you. I don't want to be around that. So there's no great options really on the herbicide side. So I just focus on how do we reduce the active ingredient. So get your water quality right. If you've got hard water, that's a big problem. Fix that. Get the pH right in the spray tank, and then add a little bit of fulvic acid or something like that to help get that active ingredient into the plant, and you can usually reduce the amount that you actually have to use. So that's where we start, just accepting the fact that a lot of people are just going to use herbicide, because they're in a no-till system and it is what it is. But if somebody wants to use tillage, I am not at all opposed to that. You can use a high-speed disc, or there's lots of tools out there. Just try to keep it shallow. And I like Gary Zimmer's approach. If you're going to till, always try to till in something green. Use your tillage as a tool. If you're using it to terminate a cover crop, or if it's eliminating a herbicide pass, for that you would normally do for weed control, I would consider that a win. Just don't completely disrupt your aggregates. And we've talked about tillage being a negative for a long time. It disrupts your mycorrhizal fungi, it breaks up your aggregates. But if you can do it in a way that doesn't just completely destroy the soil, those mycorrhizal fungi, they're still there. If you get another crop planted right away, that's the key. Get living roots right back in there after you till, so they can go out into the soil and reconnect with those mycorrhizal fungi, and it's not necessarily going to do as much damage as we might think if we can just minimize the aggressiveness of that tillage and the number of passes. So there's
Yeah,
no
and
there's no great answer. It's kind of like pick your poison. Which one are you going to do?
yeah, the cool thing is you hear someone like Gary talk, and then like you guys talk, you're all saying pretty much the same thing. The mechanism in which you terminate is just different. But
Yep.
Gary would say too, there you're not gonna till things 100 times. Shallow incorporated tillage. Those guys believe in you know bringing through a ripper at some point to help that compaction problem. Um, but you guys aren't far off by any means. It's those basic principles that are key.
Yeah. It all
Um,
comes back to context.
yeah, I think that was an important thing that everyone understanding ag, they added that to the soil health principles because that's a pretty important piece. So now let's talk about the other, I think you're probably on board with it, where some sort of livestock incorporation into these systems would solve a lot of issues. Well, actually, let's go back first. So we talked about herbicide. What piece of chemical, because herbicide isn't the only chemical being used, obviously, and it might not be the worst thing for the ground of chemicals that are being used. So when you look at herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, pesticide type applications, what are the things that you guys can eliminate quicker and first? Like, what are the things you're like, you just don't need that?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, of those kind of three categories, I would say the herbicide is going to be the hardest one to eliminate because if you don't want to do a lot of tillage, you're going to have to use a herbicide. So, there's been everybody's heard of Rick Clark. He's kind of cracked the nut on no-till organic, but that takes an incredibly high level of management, and a lot of people just aren't there yet. I don't think as an industry, we have yet to figure out how to do no-till organic on a large scale. So you're looking at one or the other. So I think that's going to be the hardest one to get rid of. Now, there's a lot of great bioherbicides coming out that can potentially help us a lot there. And there's some technology coming out that can help a lot with, deactivating weed seeds with light and terminating cover crops with intense light energy and things like that. But so that's probably going to be the hardest one. I think technology can help. There's some robotic weed mowers and things like that coming out now, but I think
Those weed
we need
zappers.
to. Yep.
Hey, do you speak? I don't want to leave this quick. Have you used one of the people that we work with? Do you know Howard Flieger at I think Contact Solutions, and they came out with that Firehawk herbicide. Have you tested that at all, or seen results from that?
I have not tested it. I believe Gabe has used some, and early results from what I've heard look pretty promising. I think it's going to be more of a cost thing, for a corn soybean
Yeah,
system, just getting the cost down on that product, so it's you know reasonable to use on a large scale. But yeah, there's definitely some things that are going to come out that are going to help on the weed control side. But I think we really need to look at the fungicides in the seed treatments, and those, I don't know which one would be easier to get rid of. Again, it depends on the situation, but I am definitely not a fan of seed treatments. And I would never recommend a producer, again, go cold turkey and just pull them out. Again, you got to fix your soil first, but if you can get your soil decently aggregated and get it to drain, that eliminates a lot of your early season issues with seed rots and, stuff trying to eat your seed basically. So the reason I'm so down on that, and a lot of listeners in the podcast have maybe heard of the rhizophagy cycle that Dr. James White talks about. And so that basically what's happening there's organisms on the seed itself that are propagated from generation to generation that do that rhizophagy process essentially. And that's basically, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, plants are basically eating bacteria. They're literally ingesting them and they're stripping off the cell wall and using it for nutrition. So in a regenerative system, we're trying to get as much nutrient uptake as possible through that process. And the reason I'm down on seed treatments is they inhibit rhizophagy. Because that seed, again, it's a baby, it's an embryo, it's inoculated with biology that it needs for the next generation. But then we take that seed and we coat it with fungicides and insecticides and whatever else we throw on it. We're killing a bunch of biology right in the root zone, right when that seed germinates. And that's when it needs it the most. That's when we need that seed to connect with the soil microbiome, because that's what's going to give it resilience. That's going to allow it to get up and germinate quicker. And so seed treatments would be one that I really encourage people to try some alternatives. Use a biological seed treatment and put some micronutrients on the seed and use that as an alternative to whatever pesticide, fungicide is on that seed. So that's where I would start. And then also the later season fungicide applications, we're seeing more and more of that on corn and soybeans. When I was farming, I started out 30 years ago in the early 90s, I don't know anybody that was using a fungicide. I mean, that was kind of unheard of. And now it's pretty much everywhere. Most people are doing at least one pass. Some people are doing two. Some people are doing three. So we get stuck on this pesticide treadmill, like I call it. It's like we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So what happens is you use a fungicide, we're treating a symptom, some issue shows up, whether it's insect, disease, doesn't matter. We treat it, but the product we treat it with is what we call a CIDE, CIDE. It's designed to kill stuff. But we know in order to have good plant health, we need active, thriving biology. So it suppresses our biology, which the plant needs to be healthy. So then what do you have? You have a sicker, weaker plant at the end of the day, even though you temporarily fix the problem. And it just perpetuates the cycle. Now your plant's sick. Now something's going to try to kill it. So then we're going to apply another product to prop it up and keep it alive. And then something else is going to try to kill it, and around we go. So we got to get off that treadmill. And one way we can do that is by being more proactive earlier in the season with some plant nutrition. Now we can go way down the rabbit hole on like foliar nutrients, and that's not for everybody. It takes a high level of management, but you can do some plant sap analysis, things like that, and try to get ahead of these issues, because a lot of what you're doing with the fungicide, you can mimic that with nutrients, and they improve plant health rather than cause issues. Because like our fungicides, what are we always talking about with soil health? We need more fungi, right? We need mycorrhizal fungi. We need our saprophytic fungi, which are decomposers. Well, we spray a fungicide on our corn, and the argument is, well, it's not really hurting the fungi that much. And it depends whether it translocates down into the roots or whether it just stays on the above ground. But even the stuff that is just a contact killer, that residue is still going to end up on the soil. That fungicide, some of that active ingredient's probably still there. So we're inhibiting our soil biology. We've got crop residue that we're trying to get to break down and cycle. Well, if we'd sprayed a fungicide on and we killed saprophytic fungi, whose job it is to break down crop residue, again, we just start creating all these cascading series of negative consequences when we use these products. I understand why people use them, but I think the seed treatments, the fungicides, we've got to start working on as an industry, using less and eventually getting rid of most of those in our crop systems. That would go a long ways towards improving not only soil health, but there's definitely connections there on down the line: plant health, animal health, human health.
Hey, eco farmers, this is Taylor Henry with Acres U.S.A. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out: the Acres U.S.A. membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres U.S.A. magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres U.S.A., but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoA conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com, or see details in the notes.
You understand why the information is where it is, because that would be super inconvenient for some of the chemical companies to just lose half of their products.
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way.
Yeah.
I think we're a long ways from
But I think
from
the farmer
them
might
having to
end up
sweat
making
too much.
a lot of money. Yeah, right. Okay, so now let's talk about the integration of livestock. I would love to see, and I know people are doing it, but that system that we talked about before, where you have, if you want to grow corn, because it seems like that's the one that everyone wants to grow, grazing those cover crops in the off season. And I think you look at some of the economics right now, you'd have to be making more money than soybeans. The problem is cattle are obviously really expensive right now. So for folks who don't have a herd, what are they going to get, or how are they going to get it? And you're going to be, you know, you have to judge the cost of acquiring all those animals. So what do you? I guess how are you introducing the cattle integration to some of the commodity type annual crop growers?
Yeah, so your average grower probably took their fences out 30 years ago and they don't have any water infrastructure. So where we're going to start there is to hopefully try to connect them with somebody else who has cattle. There's a lot of producers, again, prices are crazy high right now. I'm not going to buy cattle. I would rather just custom graze for somebody else. So I think that's going to be a hot commodity next year. Anybody who has cattle out there who they don't have enough pasture, they want grazing land, I think they'll be able to find it because the economics of corn bean is not great. So trying to connect people with someone else who has the cattle. So you don't necessarily need to own the livestock. You don't need to own the land. You don't even necessarily need to do the work. That's a huge opportunity that I see for young people to get into this industry is doing custom grazing. Let's say I'm 60 and I just got some crop ground, no fences, no water, don't want to deal with it. Well, maybe I can find somebody 10 miles down the road that's got cattle standing in a lot, but they don't want to mess with grazing. Well, there's an opportunity there for a young person to step in, take those cattle, bring them to my crop field and do the grazing. So, I mean, those are the kind of things we're going to have to look at, to get more livestock integration on these row crop acres. Get these. It's not
Yeah,
that
I
hard to keep
I
cattle in with the hot wire, and so you can haul water if you have to.
Yeah, I agree. I always tell people because I think a lot of guys and girls are going to get into that with the custom grazing. Um, they've got to get the experience and proof that they can do it because nobody's going to just let someone on their land and be like, I'm going to run cattle for the first time this summer because
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be hiccups that occur the first summer or time you run cattle. You've got to get those out in your own little testing form. So if you have 10 acres, go get two head and test them out on your own, and then be able to show these either landowners or other people who have cattle proof that you aren't going to just like either kill all their animals or animals aren't going to be running loose all the time.
Yeah, that's always the big fear is they're going to end up out on the highway, and there's going to be a liability issue or something like that. The other concern that we hear a lot as well are the cattle going to compact my field. I mean, that can happen, obviously if you got a sacrifice area or something like that, you know, you might have to go and do a little light tillage and smooth that out. But cattle don't, in general, really cause much compaction per se. They're not that heavy. So they're not causing deep compaction like a big heavy piece of equipment would, like a grain cart or something like that. So it's usually a couple of inches, not really that big of a deal. If you're going to plant corn, maybe you have to smooth it out just a titch. But that, to me, that's, I don't want to call it a non-issue, but people worry about it a little more than they need to. And keeping them off the highway, you just put up 2 or 3 wires, do what you got to do, get a good energizer, you can keep them in. But
So
yeah, I lost your audio.
I was saying the easiest, I think, way to get into this for annual production or crop guy, if you had animals or if you don't have animals, is the winter grazing, bale grazing on your fields because the production that comes from those bales. I mean, like we were walking around our place yesterday, and it's like every place we have cover crops where a bale was, it is so obvious, and it's outproducing the area around it by 10 times. Like not even joking. Like we need bales on every inch of this place, um, and I think there's a lot of people that do that where they're out grazing corn stubble, and then the corn stubble gets used up and they're back into lots. Like, why not just keep them out there, bring the bales out there, and feed them there?
Yeah, that just makes so much sense. I mean, one of the biggest cost, for beef animals, obviously going to be hay in most cases, and the more they're standing around in a lot eating hay, the more money they're costing you. Just it doesn't really matter where you're at in the
Yeah.
country. It seems like everybody's feeding hay for about 6 months. So either bale grazing or stockpile forages is another great tool. If you can get a cover crop in a little bit earlier in the year, stockpile it, keep those cattle out for as long as possible and keep them out of the lots, then you're just spending less money on feed and you're spending less money hauling manure out of the lot. It's basically a no-brainer. As close to one as you're going to get. So
some of the economics as far as getting cattle on those production fields, like what are the areas that they're going to save money on the next year?
yeah, so obviously, just having that livestock impacts hopefully going to improve your, cattle, or especially ruminants, are like walking biology factories. So they're going to inoculate your soil. So what we're hoping to see there in the long run is a bump in production the following year. So now how much of that's going to be, that's kind of an it depends question, but we just know anytime you can break up a cycle and get more diversity in the rotation, even if that's not a cash crop, could just be a cover crop, and you graze it, that's going to improve your yield. I mean, it reduces pest and disease issues. Just it's the rotation effect that everybody's heard about. So you're going to capture something there. We don't necessarily know how much. You capture the value of the grazing itself, not having to feed hay. That's a huge one. Then you're going to have the economics of not having to haul the manure. That's another value. I mean, just general ballpark numbers, people would typically figure anywhere from like $25 to $200 per acre net by getting those animals out there. So I know Sustainable Ag Research and Education, or SARE, they did just a survey of a bunch of farmers, and just grazing straight cereal rye, that kind of the basic system, and they were saying like $20 to $70 an acre gain by doing that. I've run some numbers on it, you know, grazing cover crops in the off season. If you can get say 1,500 pounds of dry matter, which should be achievable in a corn bean system, you could probably save or make about $90 an acre just on the hay savings. That doesn't count any of the other benefits of having that animal out there on the landscape. The benefit for the animal, the benefit for your land. So, and that's probably on the low end. And then I've heard numbers as high as, $200 to $250 an acre when you figure all the benefits in there, and all the cost savings on the feed side.
So last year, I'm just going to do the math quick. I wish I had it written down. Last year we had 30 head that average. It costs about $1.50 a day to feed hay to. On our cover crop fields, we put the hay bales out there and let them graze the cover crops, and it cut the hay consumption down by half for a month. So you went from $1.50 a day to 75 cents a day, and you would expect them to probably gain a little bit more. So if you'd say you add another pound a day and gain grazing that stockpiled forage, you're looking at another, say 15 pounds in a month. I mean, that's that's another $75 the way prices are right now. Or well, let's say $60 and extrapolate that over 30 head. That's some pretty good savings. Now, granted, that cover crop field was planted in June, and we let it go all the way to maturity, so you're not grazing it or taking a crop off it during that time. But I mean that pays for itself for a 30. I think it was $40 an acre for seed.
Yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable to take these, just crop budgets that are showing, negative $100, $150 an acre, and at least get that to break even, if not profitable, just with that livestock integration piece. And then the
Yeah.
longer term benefits of that it's hard to quantify, but you're definitely going to see improved yield in future years.
It's the problem of getting people back into livestock production. I mean, that's got to be the biggest issue. And
Yeah, it's
those connections for custom grazing slash, rented land, that's a chore that takes effort, takes communication. We haven't found a good custom grazing contact yet. We've done it. I haven't been able to carry it over multiple years, but I think that's part of it though. You're a business owner, entrepreneur. You got to solve problems, and those are some of the things you got to solve.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't matter, how you try to go about it. Anytime you're going to try to do something different, or you're going to try to change, from just the standard corn, soybean, Florida rotation that we jokingly say, if you're going to do something different, you're going to bring in livestock or even change how you manage your crops, or you're going to add cover crops or whatever. That's a change. It's going to require more management. It's going to require you to do some legwork. People are, if they want to get out of this commodity trap, they're going to have to be willing to just put some skin in the game. It may be direct to consumer. We haven't even really touched on that, but that's another good option if you're in the livestock industry, to capture more of that value. So, but there's no easy button, and you're, like you said, you're going to have to be willing to do some work on it.
No, and direct to consumer is a challenge too. That's a whole other business that needs to be ran. Um, it definitely is possible. People can do it really well, but that's a separate business.
Yep.
Um, what would you say? Like right now, people are getting revved up to start harvesting. What's one practical step someone that's doing row cropping or commodities could take this season to start improving the nutrient cycle and hopefully getting them some results?
Yeah, if they haven't already, I would be getting some cover crop seed ordered, and I'd get seed in the ground this fall. On our farm here in Mount Horeb, the custom operator just pulled in to harvest the corn today, and just so happens our cover crop seed showed up today. So we're hoping to be rolling here in a couple days and have that seed in the ground. So it's going to be pretty early, which is great. But yeah, I keep coming back to a living root. That's where you got to start. If you got bare soil, you're going backwards. You're losing aggregation, you're losing soil function, you're losing nutrient cycling. So I would be trying to get a cover crop out there on as many acres as possible this fall, because that's going to, if managed properly, that's going to set you up for success next year and the following years. So that's where I would start right now this fall. If they've got the equipment
So
and they got a little bit of time, they need to get some seed in the ground.
you guys are chopping that corn right now, then?
No, that's for grain. It
Oh,
seems
okay.
early, but there's people harvesting already.
Did you guys get rain down there this past week?
Yeah, it's
Or are you still
been
dry?
fairly wet. I don't know. It's been fairly wet where we are here. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, go back to the dairy thing, most of that corn that comes off, those guys are chopping it into the corn silage, and you have plenty of time to get cover crops in. How many of those fields just sit dormant, for months and months and months? There's enough time where weeds start growing back on those fields.
yeah, that's absolutely the lowest hanging fruit with a cover crop. When you look at the economics, is on a dairy farm, it's after corn silage. Is one, you can get it in
Yeah.
early, and two, almost 100% of those acres are probably getting manure put on them. And if you're putting manure on in the fall and you don't have a living root out there, you are losing many, many dollars per acre, probably 30, 40, $50 an acre. You're going to have nutrient loss, because you're going to have a bunch of nitrate leaching because there's nothing there to hold it. You got bare soil, you're going to have erosion. There's just, again, a whole series of negative cascading events that are going to happen there if you don't get that ground covered and you just leave it bare
You
and put
guys,
manure on
are you broadcasting that cover crop seed here, or are you going to drill it?
it. We're going to drill it. So yeah,
But a lot of
broadcast
those mixes
can
can
work, but
broadcast.
it's definitely more of a challenge. You're very much dependent on getting moisture at the right time to get those aerial applied mixes to grow.
Yeah. Have you seen any good success with drones broadcasting it into a standing crop?
Yeah, that's really catching on. So the drone technology is, some of the biggest drones now, they've got a payload of 120 pounds plus, so they can get over a lot of acres, and they're flying at like 35 miles an hour. They're getting very competitive with ground rigs for applying cover crop seed. So I think we're going to see more and more of that in the future. Again, that the challenge is always, is it going to rain after you put your seed out? That's really what's going to make or break it. I've seen some just absolutely beautiful cover crops that were aerially applied. They got it in at the right time. They got a rain. It came up beautifully. took the corn off or soybeans, either one, and it just, nice green carpet there. And I've seen other situations where they spread, $40 an acre mix and nothing grew. So it's really hit and miss. And that's what kind of keeps people from doing more of that.
Yeah, the weather people aren't exactly spot on either. Last week, because we got really dry here, and that rain that we got, I think 2 or 3 inches, but it was like they were giving us like a 30% chance of rain. You didn't even know if it was going to hit us or not until a half hour before it hit. Comes back to me not being able to control the weather. It really pisses me off. So you'll be at Eco Egg this year. You'll be at Eco Egg this year. What's some of the stuff you want to talk about at the conference this year?
Yeah, so what I was thinking of focusing on is more of a biological approach to nutrient management. I want a lot of the stuff we've kind of touched on in this podcast. I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive with producers on what can they do, even if they're just mostly in a commodity system. Where can they save money? How can they start improving their soil function with some fairly simple tweaks that they can do, with fertility rates and the types of stuff they're applying and when they're applying it. There's so much low-hanging fruit out there that people could be more profitable and they could fix their soil and become more resilient. So that's kind of what I want to focus on with my talk at the conference this year.
Awesome. And then where can people find out more information on you, anything that you guys are doing? How can they hire you as a consultant?
Yeah, so you can just go to understandingag.com. That's our website. You can find all kinds of information on us there, bios for all of the consultants. You can reach out to Victoria and just send her an email and she will get people in contact with a consultant. We're happy to chat with people.
Awesome. Anything else you want to mention before we drop off?
No, I think that's we covered a lot of ground there. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and looking forward to the conference in December. I think it's going to be a great one.
Absolutely. Thanks again for all the time, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Acres U.S.A. podcast, a podcast production of Acres U.S.A. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres U.S.A. is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. And we're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.